This video will discuss some elements of team design. So in the foundation lecture on team design, I pointed out that the two key elements of team design are team composition, so who is on the team, and then team structure. We will address team structure in another video in some additional depth on certain characteristics of team structure. In this video, I'm going to talk about team composition, and here specifically focus on team size. So team composition focuses on two elements. First of all, how big is the team? How large a team should you put together? And then a second element in another video is going to be about who is on the team, the characteristics of those people. And in the foundation lecture, you already heard a little bit about qualities of people like collaboration readiness, like familiarity, like prior shared experience, and a little bit of an introduction to diversity. And I'll go into more detail on those in another video. But for now, this one we're going to focus on team size. And over here with respect to composition, common pitfalls in terms of forming and designing teams are that we have a tendency to build teams that are too large. I mentioned that in the foundation video, this idea of overstaffing bias, that people tend to be afraid or concerned that they're not going to have enough people or enough resources. But we'll see in this short video what are some of the things about size that you should think about in terms of trade-offs, and understanding how do you think about what is the right size for the team that you're forming. So you may have heard or read people say things like there's the optimal size or the right size team is. And one of the numbers that gets thrown out is, I guess, 4 to 5 people. There's this quote by Jerry Useem, who's a researcher who said this in a Fortune magazine article several years ago, that the right size is 4.6. So I don't know how you get that 0.6 person in your team, but I think it's because it's the average. It's an average, and typically we see things more like somewhere between 4 and 5 people is the right size. But these numbers, it's important to understand kind of where they came from. They came from experimental research that was done in the 70s. A lot of it was done by Rich Hackman, who has unfortunately passed away, but is one of the leading developers of research and theory on teams, and he was on the faculty at Harvard. And he did a lot of very early research before teams were really sort of a hot organizational topic back in the mid-70s and into the early 80s. And that research is kind of where the source of this idea of 4 or 5 people came from. But what's important is to go back to the original sources there and say that this was really the right size to lead to optimal satisfaction among team members. And we've already talked about team effectiveness is multidimensional and member satisfaction is very important. But we are not always trying to just optimize satisfaction. Task performance matters, and arguably productivity is the first and foremost thing we care about when it comes to team effectiveness. So an important takeaway is this number came from different considerations of aspects of team effectiveness, and it really says that people like working in smaller teams, and I think most of us can feel that way. There's a lot of difficulty that happens as teams get larger. This is not the size for optimal task performance or productivity, because in fact, as we all kind of intuitively know, you need the people that you need. You know, some projects are very large. Some teams are going to maybe be into as large as 100 people, although we'll come back to the idea that operating as a single team is impractical, if not impossible, for that many people to interact. So in all likelihood, there would be sub-teams that are interconnected, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, and a lot more about that in week 3. The key takeaway is there really isn't an optimal number because the demands of the task need to dictate the size of the team. Having said that, you know, we have Goldilocks down here, and, you know, there is probably some sort of just right. And we need to look a little bit more at some of the research to think about what does that mean, and how do you think about getting to that just right point? What do you take into consideration? So, you know, what does research say about team size? This is just one piece of research evidence from a meta-analysis, and for those of you who've taken, I think at least one of you has taken one of my classes before, we talk about meta-analysis as a type of evidence. It's a very high quality type of evidence because it is a statistical analysis of multiple research studies. So in this particular case, this meta-analysis was done on 24 different research studies looking at over 1,300 teams. And the outcome they were interested in was innovation. So this is just one kind of task, right? It's a creative task, creative and innovative teamwork. But here what we see is that team size was positively related and a pretty high correlation with innovation. So it seems that one takeaway is that if your task is creative problem solving and innovation, having a larger team is probably going to be helpful. And it makes sense, again, intuitively, because more people offer more perspectives, particularly if that's also correlated with diversity. And what we see here, and in a moment, in another video, we'll talk more about diversity, but, you know, job-related diversity is also positively related to team innovation. So one conclusion from this particular meta-analysis is that if your team needs to be creative and innovative, you want to think about a diverse team, people with lots of different background characteristics related to the work, but having different perspectives, and having, you know, a sufficiently large number of people. Notice that this doesn't prescribe you need 10 people for innovation, right? It depends on the project. You know, if it's trying to modify the tuner switch on a radio, okay, maybe that's a tiny little innovation project that doesn't need so many people. But if it's trying to design a new vaccine for the virus we're facing, we are going to need to talk about massive numbers of people trying to collaborate, probably worldwide. And that's what we're seeing in terms of some of these scientific teams trying to tackle this problem. So people need diverse backgrounds to think about who knows how to sequence DNA, who knows how to develop the vaccine itself, who knows how to deliver that vaccine. That's job-related diversity, and we need probably larger teams to carry out that kind of task. So if we're trying to be Goldilocks, you know, we're trying to get this just right, and we know we have a tendency to overstaff. Here's just some things to think through. You know, the benefits of more people on a team is more resources, is more capabilities, is more information and variety of ideas that can come to bear, and upping the number of potential solutions available to the problem. However, every additional person you think about adding to the team to get those benefits needs to be countered against the disadvantages to larger teams. So, for example, one research study looked, again, it was a meta-analysis looking at, this is not a meta-analysis. This was just a single study looking at 212 people in 26 teams. And they found that as team size increased, people started to experience relational loss, right? You couldn't connect as well with your teammates. That makes sense. And they felt that there was less support to actually get the work done, harder to coordinate. And there was diminished motivation. And that comes along as that idea of free riding that we often hear about. If people are less motivated to participate, it's hard to know your place. And when we think about structure and LOL, it's hard to know specifically your role and responsibility as a team gets larger and larger and larger. So there's a whole variety of things that go wrong as teams get big. Less cohesion, right? That's an element of team effectiveness, resulting in lower satisfaction, again, lower effectiveness. People free ride, they don't participate as much. It's harder to get cooperation. We have the chance to have subgrouping and factions happen that can increase conflict. That's a negative behavior. And you don't, for every added person, your marginal gain is probably going to be declining, right? So there's declining marginal returns as you add more people, particularly beyond maybe that minimum necessary. We also get some problems like conformity pressure. So when we come back to processes next week and look at decision making, remember this with respect to groupthink. So groupthink is excessive conformity pressure. And you can think about this as a trade-off that as groups get larger, it gets harder to get the work done. And people get frustrated with how long it's taking to get the work done. So they sometimes start to elicit pressure on each other to just decide something and take the will of the group, which may end up with suboptimal decisions. And, people participate less. We'll talk about communication as an important process. And if we have uneven communication, we know that that's going to impact performance, effectiveness in teams. If we look over here then, the ultimate thing is you want small teams, as small as you can possibly have to get the work done. And there's a variety of benefits that come from this, kind of the converse of everything we saw to disadvantages. But importantly, people tend to work harder. If they have a little sense that, of urgency that maybe there's not enough people to get the work done, they tend to put more effort in. So there's a motivational quality to having teams on the smaller side. And they tend to have, there's more accountability, there's more visibility of the inputs of individual people. So people tend to take that accountability and take more responsibility and become more involved. So, if we look at this, a chart, this is maybe a little too uncomfortably similar to the curves we've been seeing for the coronavirus. But, there's sort of an increasing benefit, as teams start out, right? There's teams that are, just not enough people to probably get most tasks done. If you really need a team, just having one or two people probably isn't enough. So we see some increasing benefits of more people. And then, somewhere out here under about, 10 people, we start to see diminishing returns. So in some ways, just for coordination purposes, it is true that around 5 to 10 people seems to be the kind of ideal point where people can interact regularly. It doesn't become challenging to schedule meetings, and people can share and communicate effectively. Again, this does not mean that you simply have no teams larger than 10 people, but it might mean that if you have teams larger than 10 people, you have projects that are bigger than that you need to think about subdividing those tasks or making teams that kind of have expandable or multiple team systems working together. And again, we'll come back to that in week 3 as sort of some advanced ideas, thinking about teams that are more complex and more dynamic in organizations. So takeaway is you really can't dictate this. The task and the problem has to. But once you get past 10, you're going to be in a situation that's going to be challenging to coordinate, and you might want to think about subdividing, having subcommittees and subgroups, and having kind of a steering committee, steering leadership that only brings people together on occasion for larger scale decisions and information sessions. So, one way to think about this idea of, what's the right size as well, Jeff Bezos from Amazon had this famous quote that he said, if a team can't be fed with 2 pizzas, it's too big. So, that's somewhere in the neighborhood of the 5 to 10. And again, a project may require more than 5 or 10 people to get it done. But what this just says is we may need to have these subgroups of teams, smaller sets working on subsets of problems to tackle those individual things and then have moments of coming together. So, for instance, I'm involved in a major strategic planning initiative for the Carlson School. We have a very large committee working on this, and we have broken that into subcommittees for specific topics and specific initiatives. And then what we do is those groups meet separately on their subtasks, and then we have larger meetings, once every 2 weeks to bring everybody together to share what those subgroups are doing, gain feedback from everyone, make sure we're aligning everything and that pieces aren't going off or spinning out of control, and that there's a center of gravity to the overall project. But that's much more effective than trying to have that large set of people all together tackle all the projects. So again, the 2 pizza rule is kind of a fun way to think about it, but once you get to that point, you need to be thinking about dividing and managing multiple subgroups and subteams and thinking about a superstructure to pull that all together. So as a final takeaway, there is no such thing as an optimal team size, but you should be warned about the overstaffing bias and avoid this team scaling fallacy that Thompson talks about in the textbook, that people underestimate the added coordination challenges of larger teams. So smaller is better. The smallest that you can operate with creates a sense of urgency and motivation and accountability. And once you get to the point of teams that are somewhere around 10 or larger, you need to start thinking about subdividing the group and having some sort of flexible structure with subgroups and phased larger group meetings to keep the subgroups moving forward towards some larger shared outcome. So smallest number of team that complete the task, but again, it's going to vary depending upon exactly the problem you're facing, and recognize the challenge that's going to come along and the interventions that are going to be required when you have larger teams.